Welcome back. So the social justice group Black Sash says Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana failed to prioritize investment for the majority of those residing in South Africa. The group says while it's grateful for the increase in grants and the extension of the social relief of distress grant, it's concerned by the proposed VAT increase, which disproportionately affects the poor. But we get analysis on the budget now, and for that, we're joined in studio by Section 27's Matshidiso Lengwasa. She's with us. Matshidiso, good evening to you. And Black Sash's Executive Director, Rachel Bukasa, joins us via video link. KPMG's Roberto Buerta speaks to us as well. And the Peter Maritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group's Mervyn Abrahams joins us as well. Everyone, this is such an important discussion. And also, remember, we're looking for also your reaction to what we did here in that budget proposal by the Finance Minister. Send us a WhatsApp on 072-110-5584 or give us a call on 010-5946-010. In fact, let's perhaps give you a reminder of what it was that are some of the key points that came out of that presentation by the Finance Minister. And we talk social development now, right? Look at this. This is essentially what's going into some of the grants. The old age grant being allocated 117 billion rand, social security fund sitting at 99 billion rand, child support at 90 billion rand, other grants 77 billion, provincial social development 23 billion, policy oversight and grant administration 14 billion rand. And that's really, I suppose, when you look at the slice of the pie where social development is concerned. But Rachel, I'll let you go first, because I think for many South Africans, millions, this is what they were waiting to hear. Will we get more social grants? And you've said as an organization, you're somewhat happy with the announcements.
So, look, I think I want to correct and say that the second thing people were hoping to hear was, would they get more social grant? I think the first thing anyone would want is to hear that the economy has grown to a place where they can absorb unemployed people, because I think people would always take a salary over the option of a social grant. So while we are grateful for some of the cost of living increases, essentially of the grants, it still remains a little bit problematic that the SRD grant has not increased at all, because you'll remember the SRD is the only grant that deals with people between 18 to 59 years old. So children are taken care of, the elderly are taken care of, but anyone destitute between those age brackets that they can fall upon. But more concerning, in fact, is the increase in VAT, which we feel really disproportionately affects the poor. And the minister's inability to consider tax on corporations and wealthy individuals and try to redistribute things in a way that is meaningful has really meant that the poor are still essentially where they were at.
Yeah, you know, I want to look at some of the important services as well that, and Matshidiso, you can help us with this one. Some of the important services that government obviously needs to provide for, big chunks of expenditure is also going towards, you know, basic education, for instance, and we'll bring some of that data up on the screen for our viewers to follow. But seemingly a big investment in education. What do you make of that spend?
Absolutely. And firstly, thank you so much for the opportunity. Yes, so this is a budget that really, as Section 27, we view as it gives on the one hand, but it takes away in the other. So yes, we do welcome the above inflation increases towards education, towards healthcare. Some of the biggest we've seen over the past decade, and definitely since the COVID pandemic. But we are obviously concerned, like Rachel said from Black Sash, that the impact of VAT is disproportionately borne by lower income households. So yes, we welcome ECD injections, all of those things, but it is so important, you know, if this budget ends up getting tabled, it is so crucial that that funding actually ends up going to the intended beneficiaries. We don't want to hear stories about underspending, wasteful expenditure, because it really would be punitive, because you're taking money, you know, VAT is a tax on the poor or the more marginalized people, maybe to invest in public services, but if those public services do not perform in the same way, then it really is the most marginalized people who continue to bear that burden.
Yeah, I mean, there's also, you know, how he cuts the pie in terms of what goes towards economic development, and I think that's really important, and we'll bring some of that data up on the screen in a moment as well. But perhaps, Mervyn, you can speak to us about that, around whether or not we're investing adequately in the budget proposal that we heard today.
So good evening, Naledi, and good evening to all your viewers. Yes, so, you know, like my other colleague said, he gives and he takes.
Mervyn, are you there?
Is that we? Hello, can you hear me?
I lost you after you said he gives and he takes. Go ahead.
Okay, so I mean, the critical issue is that we agree with the minister that South Africa needs to grow its economy. That's total agreement. But however, what measures do we use in order to grow the economy? That is where we tend to differ. Now, we welcome the infrastructure spend, you know, fixing the ports, fixing the railways, the allocation to PRAZA for public transport. All of those are good investment areas. But in addition to infrastructure, we have to invest in our human capital. We have to invest in the people, and we also have to invest in the economy in the sense of people having money in their pockets in order to spend in this economy, because really our economic growth is going to come from consumer spending. And it's for that reason that we are very disappointed that you use the instrument of increasing VAT, because that makes just about all goods and services 0.5% more expensive in South Africa. It has a likelihood impact on inflation and increasing food prices. Whilst at the other hand, we see that he has given some increases, above inflation increases to social grants, which we agree with. But you have to look at those grants in the context of a very deep affordability cost of living crisis. So, for instance, the child support grant, that has been increased by 30 Rand. But when you look at, for instance, what the food poverty line is, the food poverty line, and we know the child support grant is used to purchase food, then the child support grant is about 30% below the food poverty line of 796 Rand. And it's about 40% below what it actually costs to feed a child a nutritious meal for the month. Now that's, you know, continuing this childhood poverty actually continues intergenerational poverty traps and eventually leads to an economy that cannot grow because its human beings who work in the economy are not able to function at their optimal level. So there is a bit of a disagreement as to how do we grow the economy, because we didn't spend sufficiently in this budget on investing in people.
Very interesting. I'm listening to all three of the panelists that just spoke, and one consensus there that, there's so many, but one certainly is a lot of contention around this VAT increase, right? Not a lot of people happy with it. All organizations we've spoken to so far in this discussion against it. Hubert, maybe you can come in as the head of legal at KPMG Africa. Were you expecting that we would see some sort of VAT increase, right? Not 2%, but we were going to get some sort of decimal, perhaps.
I must honestly say that even in my predictions, I said no VAT increase. I was not expecting it at all. When the regional budget was postponed because of the VAT increase, I was very surprised, and I thought, well, after that, there will be no VAT increase. And with today's budget, equally surprised that we have the increase in VAT. As my colleague said on the panel, it impacts, the VAT increase impacts everybody, the rich and the poor across the board. And the reason for that is because that VAT is a consumption tax. So in the final consumer will be the person who will pay the tax. And that would be the ordinary South African residents, because they are the final consumers of the products and the services. And that's where the ultimate cost will lie. that's why I was so surprised, because it's a regressive, the VAT increase is regressive. It impacts poor and it impacts the rich, but in proportion, it will impact the poor a lot more. The minister has announced that there will be certain food products and items that will be added to the zero list. However, this zero list, not all South Africans will actually buy and consume the additional products that was added to the zero list.
Yeah, you know, that's the thing about this zero list, and perhaps Rachel, perhaps you can help us with this one. You've got this, you know, this being put on the table by the finance minister, expand the list of zero-rated VAT products. But how much education and information do we even have going into our communities and saying, well, this is what you need to know every time you walk into a supermarket, that this is what zero-rated? Do South Africans know?
Some do and some don't, but I think more than that is the contents of this list, right? So are we talking about chicken and meat, or are we talking about the insides of an animal constituting as meat on that list? Do you get what I mean? And as my colleague rightly said, what that then means, it dictates food that not everybody eats. And so it's a little bit problematic. Absolutely, to your point, it's correct. Like, does the everyday person know what it means when this list is out? Do you have to be amongst the people who work in the field to know that this constitutes that? And what is real impact? And then when we think food aside, but also we think around issues of period poverty for young girls and hygiene products and access to those things, all those things that are taken into account, and all those things that people on the ground know about. And so the fact that the minister is prepared to do all of this, except looking at how to possibly tax corporations or prevent the illicit flows of cash, is really problematic.
You know, Matsidi, so you look at how, you know, there's a bigger investment in education. I think a lot of people agree with that. You, of course, will do the same. But there's also the issue of how those resources actually are trickling down and whether or not they get into the various communities. I mean, talk to us about that you could have a really big spend from a national point of view where Treasury makes its plans and allocations. But does it reach the people that it intends to?
Yeah, I mean, that's an important question, because for years we've seen, and I think when we entered the budget space as civil society, we just saw words of like billions that are being thrown around, like billions to education and health. But then the impact on the ground, you still hear of clinics that are dilapidated, that are falling apart, schools that are overcrowded. And, you know, it was difficult to marry the two. And yes, you know, we do have the issue of the quantum of spend, that there have been budget cuts that have translated into not enough teachers being hired in schools, especially in schools that are in marginalized communities. But at the same time, of the funding that is allocated, is all of that funding going to the intended beneficiaries? And there has been stories of underspending, you know, billions over the years, whether it's to HIV funding, but especially to infrastructure, and especially health infrastructure and education infrastructure, where those areas are marred with either inability to spend funding, especially in rural provinces, but also just, you know, lack of consequence management, or being able to trace that money has been allocated, but the project to eradicate the pit latrine, for instance, just keeps getting delayed and delayed and delayed. And it just really does point to a need for us to have a capable developmental state, that if we, whichever way that we allocate, increase funding or revenue or find debt or whatever it is, we need to make sure that it's at the heart of it is the people of this country, and that they receive the benefits of all of that funding.
Yeah, also we need to, I suppose, at some point get to a point where even communities are able to ask the right questions. If you have a community in a rural KZN where parents are concerned that their learners, their children are being educated as one of 95, in a classroom, the question is, why aren't we hiring more teachers? Why aren't we building more classrooms? And we need to get to a point where we're able to ask those granular details for the viewer. Where do they go to ask, where did that money end up? But we'll continue with the discussion on the other side of this short break. But share with us your thoughts on what you make of the Finance Minister's budget speech. Send us a WhatsApp, 072-110-5584, or give us a call, 010-594-6010. Welcome back. Well, we continue getting reaction to the Finance Minister's budget speech, right? Send us a WhatsApp on 072-110-5584 or give us a call on 010-594-6010. I was talking before the breakthrough around, the everyday South African being able to understand, right? And we hear the big monies that are being touted by the minister today, but when we get down to it, we don't see it. What then, right? So to a parent, Matsidiso, who's watching this and says, well, my child is still in a classroom with 95 other learners, what do you say to them about the trickle-down effects still not reaching them?
Sure. So I think one of the biggest goals for us in civil society is to create a budget that is for the people and by the people. So do what we can to push and pursue a budget that is centered in that way. And so it is important that the budget actually translates to the lived experience. And so, I mean, there are many ways to, recommendations that we can advise people to reach out to their representatives and their leadership. And now in a context where parliaments are so diverse that there may be more opportunity to engage with that. And so really just calling on people to take, do social audits, if this is what is experienced, excessive overcrowding, for instance, that is something that should be to the attention of the people, because it doesn't make sense that there have been increases to education budget and yet this is being, that there's still overcrowding. And so we're really calling on people to bring this to the attention of National Treasury, to Parliament, be it through submissions, and they don't have to be complicated submissions to Parliament, but to just write to the representatives and say, but where's the money going? Because we've heard the Finance Minister talk about all these billions, and yet this is the lived experience of us. And just keep pushing that, because ultimately, we really just do want to see a budget that serves the people of this country. And, especially in a context where the VAT is being increased that way, there's less money in people's pockets. And we should be seeing a reflection of that in, reduced overcrowding in classrooms and, just good quality teachers and investments in human rights for people in this country.
Yeah. Hubert, help us crunch the numbers here. Can we afford this extension of the SRD grant for yet another year? And, then there's the question of in 2026, will we see yet another extension? How long can we keep this up? Rachel's already keen to hear where you're going to take this one.
So maybe let me talk in its simplest forms around how the budget would work.
Yeah.
Generally, what would happen is that you would have income, revenue, which is the taxes that we collect, and on the other side are the expenditures, which is all the costs that government needs to pay in order to deliver on the social commitment. Now, when the budget is done, there are certain specific assumptions that is made in the budget around the revenue, which will include this 1% or the 0.5% increase in this year and 0.5% increase in the next year. So all of that is included in the revenue. And then there's certain assumptions that are made in the budget around economic growth, expenditures that will be incurred, and all other things around driving South Africa in the next year. Yeah. So to the extent that we are able as South Africa and as government to fall within the assumptions that has been made around growth, economic growth, and around the expenditures, then the revenue, including the VAT increase, will be enough to cover this.
Yeah.
However, if we are not able to comply and perform in terms of the assumptions that's made, in other words, we cannot grow economy as what we envisaged in the budget, or our expenditures are more in any other element. So we are driving a very tight line here. But if we can't comply with that, then there will be a deficit, and then this increase in VAT and the revenue that we are projecting in the budget won't be enough.
Rachel, do you want to step in there? I mean, what's interesting is in the run-up to the budget speech that was given today, it seemed that the debate was becoming VAT increase or no SRD, right? That we almost had to choose between the two. So for those that say, well, sustainability long-term may become an issue, what do you say?
So actually, the fact that we had to choose, or this narrative was out there by the minister is extremely dangerous. The one thing we have to understand about social assistance is that it's not a favor. It's a constitutionally protected right, right? So it's not out of the goodness of the minister's heart. It's not out of the goodness of the ANC's heart. It's a constitutionally protected right. Okay, that's the first thing. And then to want to say, oh, well, it's either that increases or it's an SRD grant. What you essentially are doing then is you are pitting poor people against one another, which is extremely dangerous. Studies have shown around the world that a country that has strong social protection mechanisms, right? So whether the grants are strong or all these other mechanisms are strong, what you see, in fact, is that people get absorbed into the work environment. People are able to start their own businesses. People are able to work and then rely less on state social assistance, right? But what we have right now, the fact that we have a lot of people needing social assistance is not an issue of dependence on social assistance, but rather a reflection of government's inability to create sustainable jobs and sustainable economic growth to be able to absorb those people. It is actually quite insulting to suggest, as I would imagine the conversation goes in those settings, that someone would take 350 Rand instead of a salary. If people had the option to work, people would take it. If people had the option to make money and preserve their dignity, they would take it. 350 Rand or 70 Rand as it is not a favor to anyone. It's the bare minimum government should be doing.
Mervyn, on the flip side of this, you also have, and you saw Cosatu a little bit earlier on, quite happy with the 5.5% increase to public servants' wages. Was this the right thing to do? I mean, the wage bill has been such an issue in the run-up to a budget for a very long time, and seemingly this year, not much of an argument as what you would have seen in previous budgets, and a 5.5% increase.
So it's an above-inflation increase, but you also have to consider that there has been quite a few years in which civil servants were given a below-inflation increase. So in a way, it's an attempt to rectify a situation that had gone awry almost over a period of time. And we have to say that for the majority of civil servants, they're not big wage earners. In fact, a big portion or a big percentage of the civil servants' wage are captured actually by the top officials in the civil service. So one can understand why Cosatu would come out and accept and agree with the 5.5% wage increase because of what they had gone through in the past.
Yeah.
However, we have to be careful that in our allocations that we also ensure that infrastructure is also maintained and built. So you know, when you have up to about 80% of your wage of your allocation, say for education or for health, being consumed primarily by wages, then very little is left over for the building of new infrastructure, for the provisioning of what is needed in these institutions. So we do need to find a model going forward as to what the ratio should be in between salaries and between investment in the running of education or in the running of health, etc.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that we obviously need to talk about is what this moment does for our confidence in this new administration, well, not so new anymore, this administration, right, the Government of National Unity. And there's going to be some curiosity around whether or not the budget is going to be passed. Because, again, this was a budget proposal and it does still need to go into a budget vote. You've got parties that need to put their heads together and see if everyone agrees on what has been put on the table. Just from your side, Matshidiso, as civil society, concerns around what that may look like if we see a budget that is not passed in the budget vote, firstly, and perhaps your thoughts on whether it should be passed.
Sure. So I think the outcome that we'd like to ultimately see is some form of inching towards a budget that is actually foregrounded in human rights realization. So whether it is the passing of this budget it being amended, to better reflect the needs of the people in this country, or to better reflect more progressive taxation or revenue generation that is more redistributive in nature, or it results in perhaps rejection of the budget, where we then get to test what our parliament really is like, what role they play in ensuring that our budget and overseeing a redistributive and a human rights foregrounded budget. So, we're also, along with the rights, we'll also be engaging with parliamentarians just to emphasize, and I'm sure the people also on this panel will also be emphasizing some of the impacts that we've seen the proposals to the budget have been, and we hope that parliamentarians listen to this with an open heart and an open mind, and just remember that it is that this budget is an opportunity to really build a nation that people in this country really deserve to live in. And there will be a lot of politics, and when it comes to politics, of course, there can be chaos, and also opportunity. So in the midst of the political storm, just remembering every single member of parliament that they are public servants, and they're there to serve the people of this country and to build a nation, and the budget is a powerful way to do that.
Yeah, but you've got political parties that are quite emphatic about the fact that they wanted a 0% VAT hike. One of them being the Democratic Alliance, which is a very key member of this government of national unity. Rachel, concerns of what happens if this budget is not passed and when we get to a budget vote, and your view on whether or not it should be passed. These, of course, closing thoughts.
I think it's important for the politicians and everybody at play to realize that the budget is not just, a document for the sake of it. It has real life implications for people on the ground. It has real life implications in terms of how much grants you get, this kind of services you are able to access, etc. So everyone is essentially waiting for it. The fact that this is a second attempt at doing this. One, I think, on the one hand, speaks to the strength of our democracy now, moving from a one-party majority ANC that we had, who could just pass the budget whenever, to now where there's real opposition with teeth. But I think as these deliberations happen, as my colleague just said right now, I think it's important they remember the importance of this for people on the ground, and that the politics around it should not take away that importance. And in as much as perhaps they can afford to drag this out, vote, not vote, drag this for another while, the people on the ground cannot afford to do that. And so I think it's important that particularly the Minister of Finance, we're calling upon him to really sit and hear the feedback from across the room, because I think for the first time what you have here is civil society, some corporates, and opposition parties are saying the same thing. They're saying that this is not the right move. And so I hope he can sit and really hear that and see how we proceed forward. Whether the budget gets voted or not, all we know, particularly as Black Sash, for civil society, that that increase is not the right move for the poor.
Okay. Then the question is what happens next. And in fact, in a few moments, we'll have a governance discussion around that process. But let's take a look at a few WhatsApps that have come in on this discussion as we get reaction to the Finance Minister's budget speech. Anonymous says something else, the taxi industry robs the country of billions. Find a way to ensure that they are paying their dues. Anonymous, an interesting point there. Thank you so much for that. Raymond Ngubane says a concerned government would have looked at reducing the size of the cabinet instead of increasing VAT. You don't need those deputy ministers. That is an issue that's been raised quite a lot lately. MM at Guamashu says it's elusive. The government must save money by cutting ministers' salaries. Their work doesn't deserve such big salaries. Okay, MM, thank you so much for that. Rachidi says it is so discouraging. We are struggling as it is. They loot, we pay. Rachidi, we appreciate that message. Thank you so much. Emmanuel says, good evening. With every budget speech every year, it doesn't bring South Africa to being a formidable powerhouse. Government is always quick to increase tax on ordinary people, yet the government officials live luxurious lives. It is a sad time in South Africa. All right, Emmanuel, thank you so much for that. Mervyn, your final thoughts on this one, should the budget be passed?
That's a difficult question because there are just so many different views currently. Of course, there's a whole process that the minister having tabled the budget now, the action actually now goes to Parliament. And there are various select committees of Parliament who would be looking at the budget. So there is likely to be amendments in different ways. And we'll have to see what that process kicks out. It is important that we have a budget. If we don't have a budget, it will have major implications for the country. So I would appeal to politicians not to grandstand. We have to be serious. The country is in crisis. And we have to listen to all the suggestions that are being made. And that is one reason why we are so disappointed, because there were just so many suggestions as to how the minister could have raised the revenue. And he didn't look at any of those. So really we are hoping that the parliamentary process will be a bit more transparent and they would listen to some of these suggestions.
You're about to get the last bite and I've got 30 seconds for you. If you were a member of parliament, would you vote to pass the budget?
Very interesting question. What I can say is that the VAT increase is a political and social minefield. Also, from a South Africa perspective, we can't tax ourselves into prosperity. If the budget isn't passed, then the previous year's budget will continue. And what that means is when we look at personal income taxes, which also brings in about 19 billion of revenue in this year because of the brackets that hasn't been adjusted, it will have exactly the same effect if the budget hasn't been passed, except for the VAT that isn't there. So it is an interesting question. My view is that I think that we need to focus on addressing unemployment and making sure that we have proper economic growth, which will then broaden the tax base with more revenue.
All right. Well, we'll leave it there, guys. Thank you so much for the chat. Yubat Bwete, the head of tax and legal at KPMG. Mervyn Abrams, program coordinator at the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group. Rachel Bugasa is executive director of Black Sash. And in studio with us, Matshidiso Lengwasa, who is budget policy analyst at Section 27. All right. We continue with more news on the other side of this short break. Stay with us.